Let's face it, you are more than a resume. You have a personality and things about you which just cannot be captured on paper. On this podcast, we are working to humanize the hiring experience by giving you a voice. So let's talk, learn from one another, and find that next great opportunity. I'm your host, Eric Ryan Jones, and this is Fire Before Christmas. Hey everybody, thanks so much for joining us for another exciting episode of the Fire Before Christmas podcast. Today I am joined with Mr. J Tran, and he's going to be talking to us about some financial independence as well as some other goals from his recent departure from the workforce. So Jimmy, why don't you give the audience just a quick introduction to yourself, please?
Thanks, Eric, and thanks for reaching out and inviting me on. It's a pleasure to tell my story, especially in this time and age in COVID-19 and, the various dislocations that everyone's experiencing out in the workforce. So as you mentioned, my name is J Tran, and I think you found me initially through an article I wrote on LinkedIn. So the title of the article, for anyone that's looking or wants to read it, is "I Got Laid Off. I'm Done Sugarcoating It." So, I wrote that article as a way to really, for myself, to be a little bit cathartic, to be honest with myself and what I wanted to do with my life and what I wanted to do with my career. And it's really, it's got a lot of impressions and sharing. And Eric, you found it and read it, and I'm glad you reached out. To answer your question directly, I was born and raised in Houston, Texas, where I grew up and basically lived until I was 18. I was born into a first-generation situation family. My parents came from the war, the Vietnam War, and they escaped Vietnam and resettled here in the U.S., and they were refugees. So they came in 75, and I was born in 80. So I grew up attending public high schools in Houston, Pasadena to be exact, which is a neighborhood just southeast of Houston. And when I was 18, I moved up to Dallas to attend SMU, Southern Methodist University, where I attained actually three undergraduate degrees, and then I also did a master's in economics there. One thing that I always remember my mom saying is that, if there's one thing in life that can't be taken away from you, it's education. And more, even with my recent experience, and you can see so easily how jobs and careers can come and go and can be taken away from you. But once you get that bachelor's or master's or whatever that degree is, that's something that stays with you indefinitely, forever. Unless you did something egregious to get that degree. I mean, that is something that's stamped upon you, and that you'll die with. So, I went into strategy consulting after undergrad, and I looked at a bunch of different things, from iBanking to consulting to Teach for America to the Peace Corps. But I landed into a strategy consulting firm called Bain and Company, which is in the world of strategy consulting, there's McKinsey, Bain, and BCG are kind of the three. But I did that for a couple of years, and I mentioned this in the article I wrote as well, but as a typical strategy consultant, you're in there usually helping companies improve performance. You can improve performance by increasing revenues, decreasing costs, or ideally doing a little bit of both, which ends up, driving up your profit and your earnings. So that's kind of what consultants do at a very, very, very high level. Ironically, when I was in consulting, I was actually involved in some cost-cutting efforts. I did that for a couple of years. Then I went to graduate school. So I have an MBA and an MPA, and I went to Harvard for that, and went back into consulting for a bit. And then from there, moved into an in-house role in consulting. So if you think about lawyers, lawyers often work for clients, but then sometimes they're just done with that world and they're looking to move into kind of in-house, more sustainable, less travel, etc. So same situation with me. I moved from a consultant advising clients to an in-house consultant, if you will, for a company. And I was there for 7.5 years before I was laid off. And I was laid off April 30th of this year. Of course, kind of first week of March was when COVID started appearing. And as I've discovered after the fact, April 30th is actually was a big date for some. Last day in April, I presume last day in March was probably big, and probably last day in June will also be big for uh, folks experiencing layoffs. But I also found out later that April 30th, 1975 was the big day that the American troops lifted out of Saigon. Saigon is now Ho Chi Minh City because it's the Americans lost the war and it's a communist country. But if anybody has seen the fall of Saigon or the images of the helicopters lifting off the rooftop of the American embassy, that was on April 30th, 1975. So
Wow.
a friend of mine mentioned that to me, and it's very. I had no idea. I didn't even think about that. I mean, I thought about myself and what I was going to do and my life and my family, and losing a paycheck and everything. But my friend was like, that's a very symbolic date, and I said, no, really, why? And she explained it to me, and I was like, wow, I didn't even think about that. But the end of an era, the beginning of a new one, and it was very symbolic for both countries. Both countries are doing well. Vietnam has turned a new tide, and it's a drastically different place now than it was back in the 70s. Ever since Clinton came back and opened it up in the 90s. But yeah, that's my basic background and story, and I'm happy to be on the show, Eric.
No, I appreciate that's a great introduction, and it really was that story on LinkedIn, which we'll make sure to include in the show notes for this podcast, and I think so everybody can read it. That really gravitated to me. And what really gravitated me to you was that we see a lot of these kind of posts on LinkedIn where people are talking about, "Hey, I got laid off. If you got any openings, let me know. Going to start hitting the old job seeking bandwagon really soon here." Those kind of things where everybody's just ready to hop right into their next job. And what I loved about yours is that one was the honesty of the idea of that, hey, I got laid off. It's okay. Because I know that when I went through my own world of getting laid off, that was a very taboo subject. And it was something that we didn't really want to talk about. No one wanted to talk about it. I didn't want to change my LinkedIn profile to even mention that I was seeking for an opportunity until a headhunter came along and basically smacked me around a little bit and said, no, you need to. If you really want people to find you, you got to do that. But I loved in your article how you turned around and said, you know what? I want to be able to do more. So talk a little bit about to you what that more is. I know you've got other things going on. You've got an investment group that you're part of. You've got a startup franchise that you're part of as well. But kind of talk a little bit more about that and how that leads in this idea of financial independence that you've just become really passionate about in this article.
Sure. I think this is something that we are all subject to. But once you're in a career or in a defined path, there's all these charts that show that you spend more time working than you do not working or with your kids or sleeping or any other thing, right? And so for many people, and I'm no exception really, but you kind of get pigeonholed. And so your identity, who you're about, what you want to achieve, gets stuck in your work, in your title, in what you're doing for a company. Unfortunately, that can be really demoralizing if you get laid off because that's for some people all they have. That's what they've built over time, a decade or more, and that's what they're known for. For me personally, I have tried not as much as I can. And granted, it's really hard to do this, but tried to paint a picture or a life that is as much outside of work as it is about work, right? So I'm also a husband. I'm a father to 3 kids. I want to be a business owner. I want to be a real estate investor. I'm really involved in my community. I'm on various boards and commissions, and I want to be a civic leader. I've been big on this contrarian living bandwagon, so I believe I'm a contrarian in some respects, and like to think about the world a little bit differently. So all this means is that when I did get laid off, and it was a real thing. I didn't have just one thing to latch onto. I had all of these other things. And it also hit me after I wrote the article when somebody said, oh, you've already got plan B lined up. Well, it's because I've kind of tried to build that over time and tried to pursue other things even while I was working. And Eric, kudos to you for starting this podcast because that's kind of what you're trying to do too, is to have something that you're passionate about, if it's a hobby or maybe it'll someday generate income or whatever, but it doesn't matter. It's something that's outside of what you're doing, full time day to day. Yeah, I've been really intentional about that. And part of what I've been trying to do also is achieve financial independence. So I remember, graduating undergrad in 2003, and I was in a very lucky position. But when I graduated undergrad, I remember looking at my offer letter. My salary first year out of undergrad as a 22-year-old was more than basically my parents had made. That was more than their W-2 that year after 30 years in work. So, and that was a great feeling. But I also saw that I could easily buy a BMW, get a mortgage, etc. And whatever that number is, $50,000, could go by pretty fast.
Yep.
And I could feel it slipping away. And so I became really passionate and almost fanatical about this thing called financial independence. What financial independence means is, the ability to build a life where you're not tied down to a specific line of work for the money.
Mm-hmm.
You've achieved a level of independence where you could potentially go out and pursue things that may or may not generate high levels of income or high levels of wealth. Hopefully it does. And there's all those sayings where, do what you're passionate about and the money will come.
Sure.
Well, if that's really true, this will put it to the test, right? But in order to get there, you have to have some level of independence such that you can take some risks, that you can build a business without getting an income, that you can try a new passion. But for many people, if you only have 6 months, I'm not even saying 6 months, but 3 months or 2 months of leeway or liquidity, you don't have that luxury, because once the clock is up, you need to get out there fast. And if you don't find anything in 8 weeks, 12 weeks, you start really sweating, and your life is at stake. You've got cars and mortgages and lifestyles that you have to maintain. And so I've personally been really big about FIRE, which is financial independence, retire early. This whole concept is to give yourself the leeway, the flexibility, the runway to pursue things that you're passionate about. And now that I'm in a position where I can do that, and fortunately / unfortunately got laid off, it'll push me to go out and pursue these things with that, with some of that financial independence behind me to give me the space that I need to pursue these other passions. So yeah, that's why I've been really big. And there's a whole subculture about FIRE. I mean, I'm on FIRE Facebook groups. There's a book. There's a documentary that was out about FIRE that you can find on Netflix and I think Amazon Prime and other places. So it's a big thing, and it doesn't matter if your FIRE is as a teacher, as a business executive, as a middle manager. It doesn't matter, because financial independence. You can achieve financial independence at different levels, whether it be at a $30,000 income level, $100,000 income level, or $500,000 income level. So yeah, that's something that I've been really passionate about, and now I will go on and drone you out. So I'll stop there. But I've been talking to everybody that I can about it, because I think it's so important, and I just think of a world where if everybody had financial independence, was able to pursue what they wanted, when they wanted, what kind of, what would that look like, and how many more innovations and businesses and things would we have out there. And that, that to me is exciting. But unfortunately, I think many people just don't have that luxury. And I think it is a luxury that I'm talking about.
Sure. I mean, I definitely believe that it is a luxury for some, but I agree with you that it is something that we all on some levels can pursue. And I love that idea that you said, financial independence can come at different levels. It can come at different seasons. It doesn't mean that you're completely free 100%. Financial independence may be, like you said, it may just be a certain thing in your life that is no longer holding you back. My grandparents, financial independence for them, they paid off their house.
Exactly.
They still had other bills. They still had other lifestyle expenses and stuff like that, but not having that weighing them down was a huge burden to be lifted off of them, you know? And so I could totally get that. So can I talk about a little bit about what were some of those really early young Jimmy things that you did that kind of led you down that path of saying, that entrepreneurial spirit? I have a friend of mine, just for example, that his entire life, he has been starting and stopping businesses. He ran a modifications for Jeeps back in the day. He sold parts for that. He's done other kinds of retail shops and internet businesses and stuff like that.
Sure.
But he's also held a 9 to 5 job the whole time.
Yeah.
And he's always gone back to the 9 to 5 job. I always gone back to the 9 to 5 job. It just seems like that's just kind of where society and culture has led us to. But then I have other people that have never held a 9 to 5 job. And it just amazes me that they're just continually reinventing themselves and everything like that. So what was kind of your journey, as it would be, to reinvent yourself? Because you talk a little bit about the article about how you wanted that when you were younger, but as you got into the corporate world, those golden handcuffs just kind of kept holding you back and keeping you going, as it would be.
Yeah, my experience is that as the son of my parents who were immigrants, who were refugees, who had just come to this country, many of them are entrepreneurs. If you don't have an education, which my mom was a teacher and my dad was an engineer and whatnot, but it doesn't really matter when you come to a country and you don't know, the language, you don't have the credentials, etc. Right? So often many of them just get into entrepreneurship. I mean, my mom actually worked for the U.S. Postal Service for 30 years and retired, from the government and got a pension and stuff like that. But my dad was more entrepreneurial, and I saw that around me. People were owning, dry cleaners and donut shops and grocery stores, and you see that with many communities. But I saw that firsthand, and it was always this tension of, and this is why I love books such as Rich Dad Poor Dad, and there's a lot of those types of financial independence books out there. But society teaches us that you go out, you get a degree. Ideally, you're some hard degree like engineering or science or something like that. Better yet, you become a lawyer or a doctor, and then you go out and you work and you make a good salary. Ideally, it's six figures, and then you do these certain things, and that's supposed to be what your success looks like. And so I think that that in some ways sucks a lot of people in. It sucked me in for sure. And I always had this other desire behind me, but it was almost like it was not always encouraged or fueled. You got this little flame, but if you kind of don't nurture it, instead you're actually trying to put it out. That kind of takes a toll over time when the 9 to 5, the six-figure income, all this stuff is you're praised for. Oh, you got the business card, you got all this stuff, the title, etc. So I definitely fell in those traps. But I just remember, when I was young, I was always kind of like a little bit more entrepreneurial. I loved investing. I loved, getting out there, learning how things worked. I mean, I think one of my first jobs, I worked at a dry cleaner, and I made like $4.25 an hour. And then I wanted to open up a brokerage account. I was 16 years old in Houston. I wanted to open up a brokerage account, but it required $4,000 to open up a brokerage account with Salomon Smith Barney. But sure enough, I saved $4,000 from this job, opened up my first brokerage account. I had to get somebody co-sign, I think, because you had to be 18. And that was like the seeds of like investing and learning about like, oh, what could financial independence look like? How do you save really early? How do you let compound interest drive over time wealth? And don't get me wrong, I wasn't from some privileged background with lots of money, but I could see how things could snowball. And over time, decades, you can build wealth that is generational maybe, or that could transform the way that you drive your career. So yeah, I was super intentional about it so early. I mean, back when I was like 16, and I'm basically 40 now. So through that experience, through following my dad around, who he had a couple little businesses, he was in real estate. He unfortunately bought foreclosures off the county courthouse steps, and I would follow him around. You buy houses on cash, 60 cents on the dollar, and you never see it. You've never seen the inside of these homes. And I think that was really powerful for me in two respects. First was, you kind of learn street smarts really quick, right? Being out there and there you flips or holds, and he would finance the mortgages sometimes and hold on to the properties or flip them. but you really learn how to, do the basics of real estate investing and of managing tenants, etc. So that was really interesting and powerful. The second really big thing I learned about that was, again, it connects to this idea of financial independence. I just saw how painful it was for people to be evicted from their homes. I mean, that's, unfortunately one of the worst things that you have to go through, uh, is basically be under extreme financial distress. And I said, man, that's really tough. I don't want to ever be in that position. And the way that you get out of that position is to manage your finances well. You don't want to ever be tied down to to a lifestyle that you can't maintain if you lost your job suddenly, or to a house or a car that you can't maintain. So I've just been so riveted on that. Even as I have gotten, achieved some success and my pay started going up, I was like, I don't want to get tied down to something that's unsustainable. And sure enough, I did get laid off. I can only imagine if I was in a tight position where I only had like 3 months of liquidity, I'd start getting really nervous right now because it's a tough job market for many. So yeah, in some ways, I think that upbringing kind of obviously contributed to my outlook, and it comes full circle in some respects. But I always remember that growing up, because he probably bought like 50 homes over time, and I would follow him around, fixing up these homes. And ideally they were vacant when you bought them, but many times they were not. And unfortunately, if they wouldn't leave willingly, you'd have to work out something with the tenant, but often they were in such dire straits that they couldn't really afford to pay rent and stay. And so, they would have to be evicted.
So you talked a little bit about Robert Kiyosaki's book, Rich Dad Poor Dad, which my wife and I have read and absolutely love.
Yep.
You talked about your dad and watching him buy houses and go around. That just speaks a lot to me of just how much mentorship and actually learning from others has really helped to shape who you are. So who are some other people that have really influenced you and have really helped to shape, your trajectory and your fire, as it would be?
Yeah, they always say you are who you surround yourself by, you're the top 5 people. But I have been inspired by people all around me. I've joined meetup groups that are about investing. I listened to Dave Ramsey. I have attended even these seminars that, kind of teach people how to get out of the corporate rat race. It's all kind of very ironic now, but I've literally been to these seminars that kind of teach people these things, and try to get them to join mastermind groups and whatnot. And some of them you have to pay for. So if you're listening, you got to be careful that you don't get in over your head and pay a bunch of money to someone that promises something that's unrealistic. But yeah, I've been to those, and I'm a big admirer of people like Warren Buffett. I mean, that guy has definitely achieved financial independence, and he's just doing what he loves. He's not doing it necessarily for the money, but he's been obviously tremendously successful. Still lives in the same house that he lived in the 70s, even though he's an ultra billionaire. There's another famous investor called Benjamin Graham. So yeah, there are many people that have influenced me, but they are some of those big icons. But it's also people that I meet around me. There's that book, The Millionaire Next Door. There's people all around me that are doing smart things, that are investing in themselves and investing in assets that are growing over time, not investing in things that will depreciate. They're investing in stuff that is sprouting. That's like a mustard seed that will grow, that will hopefully yield benefit. So, yeah, I get a lot of inspiration just from those types of people as much as I do from the big people like Warren Buffett.
Awesome. And if you were to sit down with somebody, wanted to start pursuing financial independence, and maybe they're one of, like, I think more than 60% of the nation or more has less than 2 to 3 months of salary in the bank. So that's why this whole COVID-19 and all the furloughs and everything going on, I think, are hitting the economy so bad, is because we haven't prepared ourselves. I know I'm one of those people that I'm not super prepared. I know that if it was to hit me tomorrow, I would be scrambling and everything as well. But if you were to give advice to someone that was just starting and just running to begin that route, what would that advice be? What would that path you would set them on?
I think if you're intentional and you take small steps, it will lead to hopefully larger steps, and over time you'll start jogging and running. So you can't get there overnight, that's for sure. And I think the tough part is it's easy to talk about these things. It's hard to put them in action, but it's doable. And I remember a teacher that I knew, single mom. She was a teacher at a high school that I went to in Houston, but she had two kids, put them all through college. By the time she graduated, she was like a millionaire, but it paid off her house, all these things on the teacher salary. So it's definitely doable for people from all walks of life. The hard part is that our society, everything that we see on commercials, etc., it's about instant gratification, and it's about material consumption. It's about happiness through luxuries. Everybody works hard for their money. I don't I don't think that people should deprive themselves out of every luxury, but it's about delayed gratification, and it's about realizing that you plant the seeds now for something in the future. Albert Einstein, probably the most famous physicist of all time, once said that compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. And so that's what you have to start thinking about is, invest a little over time, but the earlier you invest, always the better you are. Don't wait until you're 50 or 60 or, nearing retirement to start thinking about these things. Earlier is always better. And ideally, start practicing these money habits with your family, with your kids. And it's a tough thing. I think it's a generational thing. I think that baby boomers and whatnot were probably a lot better about saving. Think about the people that came out of the Great Depression era. They were much better. It's also a cultural thing. In the US, our savings rate is generally, much lower than in many developed countries. We're definitely below 10%. But sometimes, some years, I've looked at the data, we're like closer to 5%. And I always tell people, it's not about how much money you make necessarily. It's about how much money you save. So there's all of these, I don't have to beat this to death, but somebody making $100,000, if they're saving 5%, you're making, saving $5,000 a year, which is not bad, but that's the average. Some people are negative and some people are hopefully better. But think about that same scenario, but you're making $50,000, saving 20%, hopefully. $50,000 saving 20%. So you're saving $10,000. You're saving twice as much as the guy making $100,000, twice as much as you are, right? So it, and that stuff makes a huge difference. And remember, compound interest is the eighth wonder of the world. Imagine doing that compounded over 10 years. Who's ahead at the end of the 10 years? The guy making 50 or the guy making 100? It's so clear, especially when you're investing in assets. Don't invest in, I would love to own an Aston Martin, but unfortunately they depreciate over time. Imagine taking that same Aston Martin money and investing it, and what happens in 10 years. So I've just been really big on this. Unfortunately, we just don't talk about it enough. I have kids that are 8, 6, and 4, and it's not in the school curriculum. It's not in the high school curriculum. It's not in the college curriculum. I have an MBA from one of the top business schools in the US, and they don't even teach personal finance, even though these people are going to go out. Yeah. And I think one of the worst things that people, families, and individuals can experience is financial distress. And I think the whole big thing for me is to not get yourself in a position where you can be at financial distress from something you can't control, such as a layoff or a corporate decision, or some higher ups that have to make tough decisions. And I feel for the many families and households that are going to be in this situation right now, because of COVID and because of all the mass layoffs that are happening in corporate as well as frontline jobs, retail jobs, and everything else. And so the hard part is, it doesn't happen overnight to get yourself out of that position, but you just got to make slow steps. You got to start monitoring what's coming in and what's coming out. And it's easy, basic things, but it's stuff that we don't teach and we don't talk about.
Do you think anybody out there has got it figured out and has an elegant way to teach people that?
Honestly, one of the funny things is that I have a lot of interests, as you know, and a couple of things cooking. But one of the things that I have been interested in doing is starting something, whether it be a company or an app or something, to help people manage and improve their personal financial situations through financial, and achieve financial independence. But yeah, I don't know if anybody has gotten it hit the nail on the head. And you have to appeal to different audiences and different generations. Some people are really big on Kiyosaki. Some people are really big on Dave Ramsey. And others think that they're, kind of loony. So I don't think anybody, to answer your question, even if they've gotten it right, clearly it hasn't resonated, because as a whole, on average, we're not where we need to be, in the U.S., in America.
Yeah, it's funny because my wife and I we've gone through that. We did the Dave Ramsey, we've done Robert Kiyosaki or Kiyosaki. Right now we're listening to a guy by the name of Garrett Gunderson.
Okay.
Who's got some really cool, great ideas as well. But the thing with any of these people is you do have to figure out what fits you.
Right.
Like you said, it's generational, it's cultural, it's economic, it's socioeconomic. I mean, there's all these different factors that can play into how you do things or why you do things. But I love the idea of, and this is one common thread you hear from everybody, is you got to watch what's coming in and you got to watch where it's going out.
Exactly.
And that's easy. That's 2 columns on a spreadsheet, or 2 different colored notepads, however you want to do it. That's probably some of the toughest things for people to do and everything. So you kind of hinted a little bit there about the app, a little bit about the company. So what is next for Jimmy? What are your next steps? Where do you see yourself going from here?
Yeah. So, I think, in real estate, we have this saying that's basically highest and best use. So the concept of highest and best use is that you have a piece of land, or you have something that you're trying to develop, or you have a house, and you're like, oh, what's the highest and best use for that asset? So I try to think about that in my own life, and what's the highest and best use of my time, and you only have so much time, right? So for me, and again, trying to disaggregate the highest and best use from like just potentially monetary rewards. For me, the highest and best use of my time is basically doing 4 things. One is being a full-time dad. And so I have a really busy family life, and my kids are growing fast, and I really want to be there for them during the really busy stages of life. You only get your kids for that fixed amount of time, and once they become adults and maybe go to college and move off and do other things, your time with them is very limited. So I really want to focus on that. The second thing is I've been investing in real estate for a while now, over 15 years. And I set up an entity called Oaklawn Group LLC, which is oaklawngroupllc.com. But the reason why I'm very focused on that is because, one, I love real estate. I actually was working for a real estate firm when I got laid off. And 2, it creates financial independence. It creates passive income. And you can invest over time and see things grow. And so it kind of really matches up well with a lot of things that I'm passionate about. I invest in all sorts of real estate asset classes, but single family, condos, going up to self-storage, multifamily, etc. So that's the second thing. The third thing is I'm starting a small business. So I bought the franchise rights for a kids coding program. So I bought the rights for Dallas, but the program is called Code Ninjas. It's a coding program. So you start white belt and you end up black belt. So it's got a kind of a ninja Asian theme, which is ironic given my background. But yeah, I really just wanted to do that and pursue that. I mean, hopefully it does generate a return, but I've always wanted to own a small business. I wanted to have control over my time. I wanted to start something where something did not exist before, and have a physical location that I can look at and say, hey, I built that, I started that, and be responsible for the clients and the operations and all that stuff. So that's the third thing I'm focusing on. And the last thing is that I'm going to be just getting more involved civically and locally in my community, and having the, hopefully some more time and the luxury to do that. Those aren't necessarily paid at all, but it's something that I enjoy. And it's just, trying to make an impact locally in my community.
That's great, Jimmy. And it sounds like you've got definitely a lot going on, which is awesome. Any last things that you'd like to just say to the audience before I go into my last couple questions here with you?
one other thing I wanted to add, Eric, is that thinking about my own career and path and what I'm planning to do next, which is more entrepreneurial, starting a business and whatnot. The thing that has somewhat enabled that is honestly having a spouse that also works. And I think that's important to mention in this day and age. But my wife has a stable job. She works at a university, and I'm thankful for that because in our country, obviously, without health insurance or a purchased health insurance on exchange, that can be very limiting and inhibiting for people in order to pursue something new and different. So that's one big thing, and so I'm very thankful for that. And many people find themselves in difficult situations. If you do have obviously other streams that I've talked about, that's great. But if you have, better yet, a spouse that works, it provides tremendous leeway and flexibility so that you can ebb and flow as things change with kind of a dual career household.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. It really also helps to limit that risk factor that people feel when they're going out to try something new, especially if you're a single income family like ours. Going out and doing something new requires a lot more finesse because you have to be very judicious about your time as well as your expenses. So yeah, that's awesome that you have that ability, and I think people need to be aware of that and need to think those things through before they do jump out on those stuff. So that's a great point to add into it.
Exactly. As the old adage goes, don't put all your eggs in one basket, right?
Exactly. Yeah. We actually had, it's funny you mentioned that because I actually had friends recently whose family, both spouses work for the same company. And that company recently went through a bunch of furloughs and they were both affected by the furlough. So it's unfortunate, and it is that idea, like you said, of all your eggs in one basket, but they're good people. They'll bounce back, I'm sure. But it is something that's an added stress that no one actually needs, as it would be. All right, Jimmy. So one last question here. It's a question I've been asking all of my interviewees. Kind of gives us a little peek into your world, but what was the last thing that Jimmy Tran bought on Amazon?
Wow. We have been buying so much stuff from Amazon. During COVID, I told my wife, I think we're averaging 2.5 items per day. The last thing I bought on Amazon was probably a book. We've been, ironically, that's where they started, but we've been buying a lot of books, and I think hammered through 8 books or something. So yeah, that's the last thing I purchased was a book.
And if people wanted to get a hold of Jimmy and talk more about the financial independence or about some of your other ideas and stuff like that, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
Sure. So I'm Jimmy J Tran, but I'm quite easy to find on Instagram, on Facebook, quite active on LinkedIn and Twitter as well. So it's either JJ Tran or Jimmy J Tran across all those channels. I've been also posting and hashtagging Contrarian Living. Hashtag Contrarian Living, just as a way to consolidate and keep all my stuff together. But many of the things that I kind of think about in terms of personal finance and the way I approach my life, I kind of view from a contrarian point of view. So I've just sort of tagged that Contrarian Living motto. And I do have the URL, but that's my next project, is to get that site up and running.
Awesome. Well, we'll make sure to have all those links out on our website when we post this podcast and everything. All right. Well, Jimmy, I really appreciate your time talking with us today. This has been a great episode, and I'm sure you've got a lot of people thinking about what they can be doing in this time. And hopefully we've inspired some people to go out there and kind of seek their own financial independence in whatever path that may be. You've been listening to Fired Before Christmas. I really hope you enjoyed today's episode and getting to know my guests better. If you'd like to learn more about our show, please find us on the web at firedbeforechristmas.com. And any questions or interest in the show, please feel free to email me at host@firedbeforechristmas.com, or again, check out our website. Until next time, I'm your host, Eric Ryan Jones, and you've been listening to Fired Before Christmas.